So now we're going to do the next part of Module 0, where we want to investigate what is best to use for precise volume measurements, either a beaker or a graduated cylinder. And so I am on page 7 of your lab manual, going through the procedure. This is where I'm going to try to dictate and tell you what I'm doing as I'm doing it, so that you're able to write in your lab notebooks, just as if you were performing the experiment instead. And so I had a little bit of water still in my beaker, or in my graduated cylinder from before, so I'm just going to dump that out. And so I want a 100 milliliter beaker, and my procedure calls for me to measure 40 milliliters of water into this beaker. So I'm just going to squirt 40 milliliters in. So all I'm doing here is adding 40 milliliters of water into the beaker. So I'm going right up to the 40 milliliter line. I'll show you this in just a second when I'm done. So that's all I've done, is I've just added up to the 40 milliliter mark in the beaker. And so you should be writing that down into your lab notebook. Added 40 milliliters of water into a beaker. And now, as the procedure says, I'm going to transfer that water into a 50 milliliter graduated cylinder. So I transfer this in, and then I'm going to record the volume, or measure the volume, at the bottom of my meniscus. And I record a volume of 39.5 milliliters. And so that leads us then to start thinking about a beaker versus a graduated cylinder. And this is part of what you need to think about in your post lab, but we're just going to go ahead and talk about it, is we need to figure out which is used for just transporting or storing liquids versus which of those that we use to accurately measure the volume of a liquid. And it's probably pretty obvious actually just by looking at them. If we look at a beaker versus a graduated cylinder, we can see, for instance, that on this 100 milliliter beaker, see, it's a 100 milliliter beaker, it holds a total of 100, but we actually only have marks from 20 to 80, marked off every 10, and guess what? The beaker even says right on it, approximate volumes. Versus our graduated cylinders, this is a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder here. This 10 milliliter graduated cylinder is marked off with large marks at every 1 milliliter, and then there are 5 hash marks in between every milliliter, and so it's marked off with lines at every 0.2. Similarly, we have something like this 50 milliliter graduated cylinder here with large lines at each of the 5s, and then hash marks in between, and so we're hash marked off at every 1 milliliter. And we can always measure in between. Say that I have a measurement that is between 25 and 26. And so there's no mark there, but I can estimate that, right? I can say that, okay, it's not quite up to halfway in between. So I can say that's maybe 25.3 milliliters. And so graduated cylinders are absolutely used for the accurate measuring of the volume of a liquid, versus a beaker or even an Erlenmeyer flask, which are used for transporting or storing liquids. Erlenmeyer flasks actually do have a bit more of a specialized use as well. We usually use an Erlenmeyer flask when we are performing a technique called titration. And we'll see that in Module 4, and we'll see where and why an Erlenmeyer flask is preferred for that technique. But again, the take home is whenever we are performing, whenever we need to accurately measure the volume of a liquid, we use a graduated cylinder for that purpose. Beakers just to store, or if I need about 50 milliliters, then okay, I can go ahead and use a beaker for that and get approximately 50 milliliters. But if I need precisely 50 milliliters, then I'm going to use a graduated cylinder. The other thing about graduated cylinders, or really any sort of measuring tools like this, is you always want to try to use the smallest one that you can. If I need to measure 10 milliliters of a liquid, I'm going to use my 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. If I need to measure 8 milliliters of a liquid, I'm going to use my 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. I'm not going to use my 100 milliliter graduated cylinder to try to measure 10 or 12 milliliters. I'm going to always use the smallest one that I can. That will be more accurate. Just another thing to keep in mind. If we are able to hopefully come back and have some live labs this semester, or when you do go on hopefully to some other chemistry labs later in your career, or science labs, just some things to keep in mind. And so that concludes the part 1 from page 7 of Module 0.